March 29th, 1992. A Sunday afternoon at the Humana Wellington Hospital in St. John's Wood, North London. Room quiet, monitor steady. The particular stillness of a private ward on a weekend when most visitors have gone home. John Spencer, the 8th Earl. Spencer, 68 years old, had been recovering from pneumonia. The doctors had said the worst was passing. His wife Rain was elsewhere. His eldest daughter Sarah was not there. His daughter Jane was not there. His son Charles, the heir he had spent a decade desperately trying to produce, was not there. His youngest daughter Diana, the Princess of Wales, the most famous woman in the world, was on a ski slope in Austria, 2,000 miles away. His heart stopped. The medical team came. It was not enough. The 8th Earl Spencer died in that room, and when he did, not one member of his family was present. He was the father of a princess, the master of one of England's grandest estates, the descendant of a dynasty that had held power for 5 centuries. Publicly, he was the decorated veteran who walked Diana up the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral before a global audience of 750 million people. Privately, he was a man who had won custody of 4 children and then spent 20 years unable to reach any of them. This is the story of how that happened, how a family built across 500 years came apart in a single generation, a marriage destroyed by the pressure to produce an heir, a custody battle in which a grandmother testified against her own daughter, a stepmother the children called acid rain, a stroke that sealed a father behind a wall his children could never breach, and a daughter who carried the damage all the way to Paris. But that death, that quiet, unwitnessed ending in a London hospital room, was not where this story began. It was where it arrived. And to understand how a man surrounded by family could die without a single one of them present, you have to go back much further than the hospital, further than the royal wedding, further than the custody battle, or the broken marriages, or the stroke that altered everything. You have to go back to the land itself, to the house, to the name. This is the story of a family that spent more than 5 centuries building something extraordinary. A title, an estate, a place near the center of English power, and then spent a single generation watching the people inside it come apart. It is the story of a man who inherited everything his ancestors had constructed and could not build, the one thing none of them had left instructions for, a family that felt safe. It is the story of the women who married into that name and paid for it, the children who grew up inside its rooms and carried its damage forward, and the daughter who became the most famous woman in the world and never stopped searching for what that house had failed to give her. To tell it properly, you have to start with the house, because in England, in families like this one, the house always comes first. The Spencer name did not begin with Diana. It did not begin with her father or his father or the father before that. It began in the wool trade in Warwickshire in the late medieval period, when a family of farmers and merchants started accumulating the kind of wealth that in England eventually transmutes into something else entirely. Wool money became land money. Land money became influence. Influence over time became title. By the early 1500s, the Spencers had moved beyond commerce and into the permanent grammar of English power, acreage, and in 1508 they acquired the estate that would define them for half a millennium, Althorp in Northamptonshire. It was not yet the grand Palladian house that visitors see today, with its honey-colored stone facade and its rooms full of Reynolds and Gainsborough and Van Dyck. In 1508, it was a moated manor, solidly prosperous, sitting on what would grow to roughly 13,000 acres of English countryside. But it was theirs. And in the arithmetic of English power, owning land was the first step toward owning everything else. What followed was a textbook exercise in aristocratic construction, carried out across 4 centuries with a patience that only land-based wealth can sustain. The Spencers climbed. Under James I in 1603, they received their barony, the formal recognition that they had crossed from prosperous gentry into the lower reaches of the peerage. Over the following centuries, they accumulated further titles, further honors, further connections. They married strategically. Spencer wives and Spencer husbands connected the family to other great houses, other political networks, other pools of wealth and influence. They served at court. They sat in parliament. They held positions at the Admiralty, in the cabinet, in the great offices of state. They became patrons of art and architecture, collectors of paintings, porcelain, and books, improvers of their house and their grounds, with the restless ambition of a family that understood beauty as a form of power. Althorp grew, its rooms multiplied, its collections deepened, its grounds were shaped and reshaped by the fashions of successive centuries, and generation after generation, the family fused land, politics, court proximity, and marital alliance into a durable machine. The kind of aristocratic engine that once built could sustain itself almost indefinitely, provided each generation did its part. And that was the condition. That was always the condition. The house survived because each generation treated it not as a possession, but as a sacred obligation. The title survived because each generation produced a male heir to carry it forward under the rules of primogeniture, the system by which everything of consequence passed to the eldest son, and everyone else received whatever goodwill and provision the family could afford. The social position survived because each generation married appropriately, served dutifully, managed the tenants competently, maintained the house visibly, and understood that the family's standing was not a gift but a debt, owed to the ancestors who had built it and to the descendants who would inherit it. There was a word for this in the Spencer world, though it was rarely spoken aloud because it did not need to be. The word was duty. And duty in a family like this meant something more consuming than most people will ever understand. It meant that every Spencer who carried the name was not merely a person living a life. They were a link in a chain that stretched back 500 years and was expected to stretch forward for 500 more. The house did not belong to them. They belonged to the house. There is something about that arrangement worth sitting with for a moment. Because from the outside, a family like the Spencers looks like the beneficiary of an extraordinary inheritance, wealth, beauty, prestige, a place in the English landscape that most people can only visit as paying tourists during the summer months. And all of that is true. But from the inside, the same inheritance operates as a kind of permanent surveillance. The house watches, the portraits on the walls, ancestors in wigs and armor and court dress watch. The estate accounts watch. Every generation is measured against the ones that came before, and the measurement is not sentimental, it is structural. Did you maintain the house? Did you manage the money? Did you marry well? Did you produce the heir? Did you behave in a manner that preserved the family's standing? Did you keep what was given to you? The Spencer archives, maintained with the meticulous care you would expect from 5 centuries of self-documentation, emphasize the achievements, the artistic patronage, the political influence, the agricultural leadership, the scholarly stewardship of the collections. What they do not emphasize, what no family archive ever does, is the cost. The loneliness of a wife who served her reproductive purpose and found herself surplus to the household's deeper requirements. The silence of a younger son who would inherit nothing of consequence, while his elder brother inherited everything. The pressure on an eldest son who understood, from boyhood, that his entire value to the people around him lay in his willingness and ability to continue the line. That pressure was not unique to the Spencers. It was the operating system of the English aristocracy for centuries, the unspoken contract that sustained every great house, from Chatsworth to Blenheim to Woburn. But it mattered to the Spencers in particular, because it was the world into which John Spencer, the man who would become the 8th Earl, the man who would father Diana, the man who would die alone in a hospital bed in 1992, Sasdom, was born. And it mattered because John absorbed that system completely. He did not rebel against it. He did not question it. He did not develop the emotional vocabulary to examine what it was doing to him or to the people around him. He simply became it. And then he applied it with devastating consequences to the family he built around himself. To understand what John Spencer did to the family he eventually ruled, you have to understand what the family had already done to him. John's father was Albert Edward John Spencer, the 7th Earl Spencer, a man best understood as a shaping force rather than a fully separate protagonist in this story. Albert was scholarly, house-minded, and exacting, a custodian in the deepest sense, a man who understood his role on earth as the preservation and improvement of what had been placed in his care. He was not, by the accounts available, a warm father. He was a correct one. He impressed the importance of Althorp upon his son, not through affection, but through expectation. not through conversation, but through the silent weight of example. Later accounts, drawing on the family's own recollections and on the biographical work that would eventually surround Diana's life, describe Albert as daunting and describe the young John as a son, made anxious by the inheritance long before he actually inherited. That anxiety was not irrational. It was the natural product of growing up in a house that had been telling the same story for centuries. You are the custodian, you are the link, and you must not be the one who breaks the chain. Albert did not need to articulate this in lectures or ultimatums. The house articulated it for him. Every corridor, every painting, every acre of Northamptonshire farmland whispered the same message to the boy who would one day be responsible for all of it. And John listened. He listened so well that by the time he reached adulthood, the message had become indistinguishable from his personality. And there was a financial dimension to the anxiety that Albert transmitted, whether intentionally or not. Althorp was old wealth, but old wealth in England has a particular quality that outsiders rarely understand. It is magnificent and illiquid at the same time. The house was full of priceless art. The land stretched for miles. The title commanded deference, but maintaining a 13,000-acre estate, paying the staff, repairing the roofs, heating the rooms, and managing the agricultural operations required a constant flow of money that the house itself did not generate in sufficient quantity. Later biographical accounts, drawing on Andrew Morton's work, estimated that when John eventually inherited the earldom in 1975, he also inherited death duties amounting to approximately £2.25 million, a staggering sum, along with running costs of roughly £80,000 per year. Those figures belong to a later chapter of this story, but they cast a long shadow backward. John grew up knowing, at some level that may not have been fully conscious, that the house he was expected to preserve was also the house that might consume him. That knowledge did not make him question the system. It made him grip it tighter. What John became, outwardly, was exactly what the system required. He went to Eton, where Spencers had gone before him, where the sons of English aristocratic families learned not merely Latin and mathematics, but the social codes that would govern their adult lives. Who to befriend, how to speak, what to value, what never to discuss. He went to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, where he trained as an officer. He served in the Second World War with genuine distinction, arriving in France shortly after D-Day as a young officer and earning a mention in dispatches for his conduct under fire. The war gave John something that peacetime never quite replicated, a purpose that was immediate, physical, and unambiguous. He was brave. That much is not in dispute. What the war also gave him, less visibly, was a template for adult life that was entirely male, entirely hierarchical, and entirely organized around the suppression of vulnerability. An officer did not discuss fear. He managed it. An officer did not share uncertainty with his men. He absorbed it. Those habits were useful in Normandy. They would prove catastrophic in a marriage. But bravery in combat and bravery in intimacy are different capacities entirely, and the war did not teach him the second kind. After the war, John took up a role of extraordinary social proximity, equerry to King George VI, and later to the young Queen Elizabeth II. That position, gentleman attendant to the sovereign, personal aide to the monarch during public and private engagements, was not merely ceremonial. It placed John Spencer at the absolute center of the world his family had spent centuries positioning themselves to inhabit. He was inside the palace. He was trusted by the crown. He was, in the language of his class, one of them. He was handsome in the way that English aristocrats of his generation were often handsome, tall, well-built, with the scrubbed, open features of a man who had spent his youth outdoors and in uniform. He danced at the correct parties, shot at the correct weekends, attended the correct services. He moved through the rituals of post-war upper-class England with the ease of a man who had been rehearsing for them since childhood. Publicly, John Spencer was everything an eldest son of his generation was supposed to be. Decorated, connected, presentable, and available. Privately, he was something else. He was a man who understood duty far better than he understood closeness, who could manage an estate diary, but not a conversation about feelings, who had been taught by his father, his school, his regiment, and his entire social world that emotional restraint was not a limitation, but the highest form of masculine virtue. He carried that conviction into every room he entered. He would carry it into his marriage, and it would cost everyone around him. But before the marriage, there was the woman. And Frances Ruth Roche deserves to be understood on her own terms before the Spencer machinery closed around her. Frances was born in 1936, the daughter of Maurice Roche, the fourth Baron Fermoy, and his wife Ruth, who would become one of the Queen Mother's most intimate companions. The Fermoy title was Irish in origin and relatively recent by aristocratic standards. But what mattered was not the title's vintage. What mattered was its geography. The Fermi family occupied Park House, a substantial 10-bedroom residence on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, not adjacent to the royal family's country residence, but literally within its grounds, separated by a short walk and an understanding of mutual social convenience that went back decades. Frances grew up in the shadow of royalty in the most physical sense possible. The Queen's children were her neighbors. The rhythms of the royal calendar in Sandringham at Christmas, the quiet Norfolk winters, the summer migrations, were the rhythms of her own childhood. She was beautiful, sharp, and possessed of a vitality that expressed itself not in academic distinction, but in social presence. By every account, she was someone who filled a room with energy, who laughed easily, who wanted to be at the center of whatever was happening. She was also at 18 walking into a world that had no particular interest in her energy or her laughter. It wanted something else from her entirely. She married John Spencer on the 1st of June, 1954, in Westminster Abbey. He was 30, she was 18. The ceremony was attended by the Queen. The photographs show a young bride of extraordinary loveliness and a groom of military bearing, standing in one of the most symbolically powerful churches in the English-speaking world, surrounded by the exact collection of titled, connected, socially impeccable guests you would expect at such a union. The match looked to anyone watching like the beginning of exactly the kind of story these families had been telling for centuries. Old title met royal adjacency. Spencer land met Fermoy connections. A future earl met a future countess. Everything was correct. What John Spencer needed from his marriage was not companionship, conversation, or emotional partnership. He needed an heir, a son, a male child who would carry the Spencer name forward, inherit the Spencer title, and eventually take custody of the Spencer house and its 13,000 acres. That need was not a preference. It was existential. Without a surviving son, the earldom would pass sideways to a collateral branch, the direct line would end, and 5 centuries of careful dynastic construction would come undone in a single generation. Frances, walking down the aisle of Westminster Abbey at 18, may not have fully grasped the weight of that expectation. She would learn. The education would be thorough, prolonged, and merciless. Standing behind Frances throughout that education, watching and calculating, was her mother. Ruth, Baroness Fermoy, requires her own reckoning, because her role in what followed would prove to be one of the most quietly devastating betrayals in this entire story. Ruth was born Ruth Sylvia Gill in Bealdside, Aberdeenshire, in 1908. She studied piano at the Paris Conservatoire with genuine distinction and married Maurice Roche, the fourth Baron Fermoy, in 1931. By the time her daughter married John Spencer, Ruth had established herself as a permanent fixture of the Queen Mother's inner circle. A lady in waiting, a companion, a confidant whose access to the most powerful woman in the British establishment was both her vocation and her identity. Ruth understood power. She understood positioning. She understood that proximity to the senior royals was the most valuable currency in her world, and she guarded that currency with an intelligence that bordered on ferocity. She was shrewd, socially disciplined, impeccably mannered, and possessed of a particular gift for cruelty that operated entirely within the bounds of propriety. She could destroy someone at a dinner table without ever raising her voice or violating a single social convention. She smiled beautifully. She spoke with care. She served the Queen Mother with absolute, unquestioning loyalty. And when her own daughter's marriage began to disintegrate, when Frances needed her most, Ruth Fermoy would make a choice so cold, so publicly damaging that its consequences would echo through the Spencer family for a generation. But that choice has not yet arrived in this story. For now, what matters is this. Frances married John Spencer with her mother's full endorsement, and Ruth endorsed the match because it was correct. In Ruth's world, correctness was the only virtue that counted. Love was useful if it happened to be present. It was not required. The children who would inherit the consequences of all these arrangements arrived in rapid succession, each one entering a household that looked from the outside like a picture of aristocratic fulfillment. Sarah was born in 1955, the eldest daughter, old enough to observe the adult world forming around her, young enough to absorb its tensions without the language to name them. In later life, Sarah would remain comparatively private, but her long presence at the edge of the family story, her role in Diana's memorial trust, her quiet stewardship of her own life, away from the public glare, marks her as someone who witnessed everything and chose, almost entirely, not to speak about it publicly. That silence in a family like this is its own form of testimony. Jane followed in 1957, quieter, steadier, the child who seemed to understand instinctively that the safest path through a volatile household was the one that attracted the least attention. Jane's later life would vindicate that instinct in striking fashion. She married Robert Fellows, a career courtier who would eventually become the Queen's private secretary, and in doing so, she moved not away from the establishment that had shaped her, but deeper into its administrative heart. Where Diana would eventually collide with the palace, Jane would inhabit it. Where Diana would rage against the institution, Jane would serve it. That contrast, two sisters from the same broken household, one hurling herself against the walls and the other learning to live inside them, tells you something important about the range of survival strategies the Spencer family produced in its children. And then, on the 12th of January 1960, a son, the Honorable John Spencer, the heir, the answer to 5 centuries of expectation. He lived for 10 hours. He died the same day he was born, and the cause was not made widely public, and the grief was not made widely visible, because that was not how families like the Spencers handled loss. They endured it, they moved forward, they tried again. But in those 10 hours, or more precisely in the years that followed them, something happened to the Spencer marriage that no amount of subsequent children could repair. The baby boy existed long enough to be named, long enough to become a dynastic answer, and then he vanished. The grief was real and private, and by all available accounts, largely unshared between the two people who should have been able to share it most. The marriage had failed to produce a surviving male heir, and the pressure to try again to accomplish the one thing the system demanded above all else now bore down on Frances with a weight that later accounts describe as suffocating. Charles Spencer, decades later, called the years surrounding his brother's death and the subsequent pregnancies a dreadful time, and, in his assessment, probably the root of his parents' eventual divorce. There is something devastating about that formulation. The son whose birth was supposed to save the family believed, looking back as an adult, that the desperation to produce him was what destroyed it. Diana Frances Spencer arrived on the 1st of July 1961, a girl born into a household still shadowed by the loss of the son who had come before her. She was healthy, she was loved in the way that parents love a wanted child, and she was, in the deepest structural sense of a dynasty that counted in male heirs, not what was needed. That is not a judgment on how John and Frances felt about her as their daughter. It is a description of the system she was born into. A system that measured children partly by their capacity to solve a problem that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with continuity. Diana could not solve it. She was a daughter. The problem required a son. What Diana would come to understand, as she grew older and as the family's private history became clearer to her, was that she had been born into a gap between the dead brother she never knew and the living brother who had not yet arrived. That position, the child who comes after the loss and before the solution, would mark her in ways that neither she nor anyone around her fully understood at the time. She would spend the rest of her life trying to be chosen, to be enough, to be the person who mattered most in the room. The pattern began here, in a nursery at Park House, in a household that was counting and hoping and waiting for someone else. Charles Edward Morris Spencer arrived on the 20th of May 1964, and the problem was solved. The heir existed. The line was secure. The 500-year chain had its newest link. There were celebrations. There was relief. There was presumably the kind of joy that follows years of dread. But something had been broken by the waiting, not just in the marriage, but in the emotional architecture of the household itself. The children born before Charles had grown up inside a house where a mother's worth was being measured, pregnancy by pregnancy, against a dynastic requirement. The arrival of the longed-for son did not retroactively erase that atmosphere. It did not heal what had cracked under the strain. Charles Spencer later described those years as a dreadful time and said he believed the pressure was probably the root of his parents' divorce. The heir had come. The reproductive crisis was over. The emotional crisis was only beginning to show its shape. There is something else about Charles's arrival that matters. He was the youngest. He was the answer. He was the child whose existence justified, in the eyes of the system, everything the family had endured to produce him. That is a weight to carry for any child, but especially for a child who would later discover that the family he was born to save had already been beyond saving by the time he arrived. Charles and Diana, the two youngest, separated by 3 years, would become, in their own later telling, the pair who were in it together. When the household finally shattered, they were the ones left holding each other's wreckage. That alliance, born in a nursery and tested across decades, would prove to be one of the most enduring things the Spencer family produced. By the mid-1960s, the Spencer household at Park House contained everything the dynasty had demanded. 4 surviving children, Sarah, Jane, Diana, and Charles, including the male heir. The public image was golden. Beautiful children in a beautiful Norfolk setting, a handsome father with royal connections, a pretty young mother, a house on the Sandringham estate with the Queen as near neighbor. Park House itself was a comfortable, sprawling place, not Althorp, not a great house in the grandest sense, but handsome and warm, with enough bedrooms for the children, enough grounds for the dogs, and enough proximity to the royal estate that the Spencer children grew up knowing the royal children in the easy, unforced way that neighbors' children know each other. Prince Andrew and Prince Edward were nearby. The world they all inhabited was small, interconnected, and governed by assumptions that nobody thought to question. The social calendar was one of weekend shoots and summer garden parties, church on Sundays, and the London season in its appointed months. School terms that began and ended with long drives between Norfolk and the capital. Nannies and governesses moved through the household. Staff managed the daily rhythms. There were birthday parties and pony rides and the rituals of an English country childhood that in photographs looked timeless and serene. Frances was vivid, energetic, still young, not yet 30, and by all accounts a mother who was present and loving in the early years, the kind of mother who got down on the floor with her children, who laughed, who brought a warmth to the household that John himself could not provide. John was respectable, steady, correct, and emotionally somewhere else. The marriage had the outward shape of partnership without its substance, but the children were small enough, and the days were full enough, and the world was ordered enough that for a brief period, perhaps 5 or 6 years at most, the family looked like what it was supposed to look like. That period would not last, but it mattered. It mattered because Diana, in particular, would carry the memory of those early years as proof that happiness had once been possible, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to find her way back to something like it. Beneath the surface, the cracks were already load-bearing. Frances was bored and she was lonely. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and restlessness, living in rural Norfolk with a husband who communicated primarily in silences and a social calendar that revolved around the same faces, the same houses, the same conversations repeated with minor seasonal variation. London pulled at her. There were new friends, new dinners, new rooms in which she was not simply the wife of the future Earl Spencer, but a woman with her own appetites and her own mind. And somewhere in the widening distance between Park House and the life she craved, a man named Peter Shand Kidd entered the orbit. The affair had not yet surfaced publicly. The separation had not yet been announced. The custody battle, the one that would scar every child in that household and send its consequences ricocheting through the next 30 years of English public life, had not yet begun, but the fracture was already there, invisible and load bearing, running through the foundation of everything John Spencer had built. The family had taken its shape. The heir had arrived. The house was occupied. The photographs from those years show exactly what was supposed to be shown: a handsome couple, beautiful children, an English country life of apparent warmth and ease. But the sun had come, and the marriage had not healed. Francis was moving toward the door, and nobody, not John, not Ruth Fermoy, watching from Sandringham, not the children who would spend the rest of their lives reckoning with what happened next, could stop what was coming. The sun had finally arrived, and somehow that had not saved anything at all. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. There is a version of this story, the version Francis's friends would later tell, the version Diana absorbed and carried with her, in which those early years at Park House were genuinely happy. Not perfectly happy. Not the kind of happiness that survives close examination, but happy enough. Happy in the way that young families with money, space, and healthy children can be happy when nobody looks too carefully at the marriage underneath. And for the purposes of understanding what came next, it matters that you believe in that happiness. At least partially, because the destruction that followed only registers as destruction if there was something real to destroy. Park House in the late 1950s and early 1960s was a household that functioned. The children were cared for. The nannies were competent. The grounds were beautiful in wide Norfolk lawns running toward the edges of the Sandringham estate, where the children could wander and play in the particular freedom that belongs to English country childhoods of that era and that class. Sarah, the eldest, was already developing the sharp, confident personality that would mark her adult life, opinionated, socially assured, and watchful in the way that eldest children in unstable households often are, even before the instability becomes visible. Jane was quieter, more contained, already the sister who noticed things without comment. Diana was a toddler, then a small child, blonde and lively, and by all accounts hungry for affection, in a way that seemed outsized even for her age. And Charles was a baby, the youngest, the precious boy, watched over with a particular kind of attention that had nothing to do with ordinary parental love and everything to do with the decades of dynastic anxiety that had preceded his arrival. The rhythms of the household were those of the English upper class in his mid-century form. There were dogs, always dogs in these houses, spaniels and retrievers padding through corridors and lying by fires. There were meals served at regular hours, with the children eating separately from their parents in the early years and graduating to the dining table as they grew. There were Sunday mornings at church, the family walking across to the estate chapel or driving to the local parish, performing the weekly ritual of attendance that was as much social as spiritual. There were holidays. There were visits from grandparents, Ruth Fermoy arriving from elsewhere on the Sandringham estate with the particular authority of a woman who lived in permanent proximity to the Queen Mother and who expected deference accordingly. There were Christmas seasons when the royal family was in residence nearby, and the Spencer children might see the Queen's children, might be invited to a film screening or a party, might experience, in the casual way of neighboring families, the presence of monarchy as a fact of their geography, rather than a source of awe. John in these years was not yet the Earl. He was still Viscount Althorp, the heir waiting, and the wait suited him in some respects. He had his public duties, his connections to the court, his standing in Northamptonshire, his place on the right committees and at the right dinners, but he did not yet carry the full weight of the earldom, the house, the estate, the death duties, the decisions. He was a man in the antechamber of his inheritance, and that antechamber was comfortable enough. He shot. He attended the races. He managed the parts of the estate that fell within his responsibility. I was, by the accounts of those who knew him socially, a pleasant, somewhat formal man who could be charming in company without ever being truly intimate. He had friends. He had standing. He did not, so far as anyone could tell, have the capacity to discuss with his wife the things that were going wrong between them. Frances, meanwhile, was a young mother in her 20s, living in a large house in rural Norfolk with a husband who was physically present and emotionally elsewhere. That combination, the beautiful house, the beautiful children, the beautiful emptiness at the center of the marriage, is one of the most common stories in English aristocratic life. And it is common precisely because the system that produced it did not recognize emotional neglect as a category of failure. A husband who did not drink to excess, who did not beat his wife, who provided handsomely, who maintained the house and the name. Such a husband was, by the standards of his class, adequate, more than adequate, exemplary. The fact that Francis was lonely, that the conversation at dinner dried to nothing, that the sexual life of the marriage had become a matter of reproductive obligation rather than desire, none of that registered as a problem within the social framework that governed their world. It registered only as a private discomfort to be managed quietly, like a draft in a bedroom or a crack in the plaster, something to be endured. But Frances was not built for endurance. That was her glory, and within the terms of her marriage, her fatal flaw. She was built for movement, for energy, for engagement with the world. She wanted to talk and be heard. She wanted to laugh with someone who was laughing back. She wanted, in the simplest and most human sense, a partner, and John Spencer was not one. He was a custodian. He was a title in waiting. He was a man whose deepest emotional commitments were not to the woman in his bed, but to the house he had not yet inherited and the son who had not yet been born. And then, after Charles arrived, to the knowledge that the job was done and the marriage could now coast on its structural foundations, without anyone asking whether those foundations included love. What the public saw, if it looked at the Spencers at all during these years, was nothing unusual. A viscount and his pretty wife, children at Sandringham, a family that would become interesting later when one of those children married the Prince of Wales, but that for now was simply one of hundreds of similar families occupying similar houses across the English countryside. The photographs from this period, and there are photographs because families like this always documented themselves, show what photographs of this class always show. Children in smock dresses and short trousers, a mother with a camera-ready smile, a father standing slightly to the side, correct and composed. The gap between what the camera captured and what was actually happening inside that house is the gap this entire story lives inside. The cracks, when they became visible, did not announce themselves with a single dramatic incident. They accumulated. Frances began spending more time in London. At first, the trips were ordinary enough. A shopping, friends, the social obligations that any woman of her class would have maintained, a fitting at a dressmaker, lunch with someone from school days, an evening at someone's house in Belgravia, where the conversation moved at a different speed and the company did not consist entirely of Norfolk neighbors discussing the same subjects they had discussed at the last dinner and the dinner before that. But the frequency increased. The stays grew longer. The returns to Norfolk became more reluctant, more dutiful, more obviously the behavior of a woman who was going back to something rather than going home to it. John noticed, or did not notice, or noticed and chose not to address what he was seeing, because addressing it would have required the kind of direct emotional confrontation that every institution he had ever passed through, Eton, Sandhurst, the palace, his own family, had taught him to avoid. The silence between them deepened. It was not the silence of contentment, it was the silence of two people who had stopped trying. And in the social world they inhabited, that silence was not recognized as a crisis. It was recognized as a marriage. There were, according to later accounts, small cruelties that accumulated into an atmosphere. The way John could make Frances feel invisible at a dinner table. The way Frances could make John feel inadequate by the simple fact of her unhappiness. The way the children, Sarah old enough to sense it, Jane absorbing it quietly, Diana too young to understand it but not too young to feel it, move through a household where the adults were performing a marriage rather than living one. The weight of repeated pregnancies, the unspoken comparison between the dead son and the living daughters, the slow grinding recognition that the man she had married at 18 was not going to change. All of it pressed down on Frances until the pressure found a crack, and the crack had a name. Peter Shandkid was a wallpaper heir. His family had built a fortune in the wallpaper manufacturing business, with enough money to be interesting and enough charm to be dangerous. He was tall, attractive, in a rougher, more vital way than John Spencer, And he possessed the quality that Frances's husband most conspicuously lacked. He paid attention to her. He listened. He laughed. He treated her as a person rather than as a component of a dynastic machine. He was also married to Janet Monroe Kerr, an artist with whom he had 3 children, and his entry into Frances Spencer's orbit introduced the element that would ignite everything. The precise timeline of the affair is difficult to reconstruct with certainty, and the participants naturally offered different accounts in the years that followed. What is clear is that by 1966 or 1967, Frances and Peter were deeply involved, and the involvement was not a passing indiscretion that might be managed with the discreet blind eye that aristocratic marriages had traditionally turned toward such matters. It was an escape route. Frances was not merely attracted to Peter Shandkid. She was attracted to the possibility of a life in which she was wanted for herself, for her company, her conversation, her presence, rather than for her capacity to produce heirs and maintain a household. That distinction between being desired as a person and being valued as a function was the fault line that ran through everything. The separation, when it came in 1967, was the first decisive fracture in the Spencer family. Frances left Park House. She moved toward London, she moved toward Peter, and in doing so, she moved away from her children. Or, more precisely, she moved into a position where her access to her children could be controlled by the man she was leaving and the social system that stood behind him. Diana was 6 years old, Charles was 3, Sarah was 12, Jane was 10. Each of them experienced the departure differently, but none of them experienced it as anything other than a catastrophe. The household at Park House after Frances's departure was a study in managed absence. The nannies remained. The routines continued. Meals were served, school runs were made, but the center of the household, the person who had brought warmth, laughter, physical affection, the person who had got down on the floor with the children and held them, was gone. In her place was John, who could not fill the gap and who did not, by temperament or training, know how to acknowledge that the gap existed. The children were told what children in these families were always told, that things would be all right, that arrangements were being made, that they would still see their mother. The explanations were inadequate, as such explanations always are, when directed at children, too young to understand the adult machinery of separation, and too old to be distracted from the fact that their world had just broken in half. There were arguments about Christmas. There were negotiations about weekends. There were handovers at agreed upon locations, where children were passed between parents like parcels, each transition a small reenactment of the original abandonment. There is an image from this period that has passed into the private mythology of the Spencer family, an image so emotionally concentrated that even allowing for the distortions of memory and later retelling, it cannot be ignored. Charles Spencer, in his adult recollections, described a scene in which Frances, while packing to leave, promised Diana that she would come back. And Diana waited. She waited on the doorstep of Park House, watching for her mother's car, holding the promise like a physical object. The car did not come back. The promise was not kept, not in the way a 6-year-old understood keeping a promise. Frances did return, in the sense that she remained a presence in her children's lives, fought for access, saw them during holidays and designated weekends, but she did not come back in the way Diana needed her to come back, which was completely, permanently, and without condition. That image, the child on the doorstep, the empty drive, the promise dissolving into an English afternoon, is the emotional origin point of almost everything Diana became. The woman who would spend her adult life searching for love, who would marry a prince and find the palace as cold as Park House, who would reach out to strangers and cameras and crowds for the warmth that her own family had failed to provide. That woman began here, on this doorstep, at 6 years old, watching and waiting for someone who was not coming back. What followed the separation was not merely a divorce, it was a war. And like most wars fought within the English upper class in the 1960s, it was conducted with a savagery that was all the more devastating for being wrapped in the language of propriety. John Spencer filed for divorce, Frances countered. The central battleground was custody of the children. In the social and legal climate of 1960s England, a mother who had left her husband for another man was not merely a divorcee. She was a deserter. The moral calculus of the era, particularly within the aristocratic world where the Spencers move, weighed adultery against maternal claim and found the adultery heavier. It did not matter that Jonna was emotionally remote. It did not matter that Frances had been lonely for years, that the marriage had been a cage of duty and silence, that she had endured repeated pregnancies under dynastic pressure. What mattered in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of their shared social world was that she had left. She had gone to another man. She had broken the contract. The custody proceedings took place in 1969, and they produced a result that would scar the family for a generation. John was awarded custody of all 4 children. Frances lost. The court decided that the father, the Viscount, the future Earl, the man with the house, the title, the royal connections, the impeccable social standing, was the more suitable parent. And the single most devastating piece of testimony in those proceedings came not from John's solicitors, not from expert witnesses, not from any outside authority. It came from Ruth, Baroness Fermoy, Frances's own mother. Ruth testified against her daughter. The precise content of Ruth's testimony has never been made fully public, and the family's accounts of what she said and why she said it vary depending on who is telling the story. What is not in dispute is the fact itself. A mother stood in a courtroom and helped her son-in-law take her grandchildren away from her daughter. The effect was annihilating. It did not merely influence the legal outcome, though it almost certainly did, because Ruth Fermoy's standing, her royal connections, her reputation as a woman of unimpeachable respectability gave her words a weight that Frances's own testimony could not match. It also destroyed something between mother and daughter that would never fully recover. Frances and Ruth's relationship fractured over that courtroom testimony and remained fractured in various states of coldness and estrangement for the rest of their lives. Ruth had chosen the system over her child. She had chosen correctness over compassion. She had chosen the Spencer machinery, the title, the house, the appearance of order, over the woman who had given her grandchildren. And in doing so, she established a pattern that would repeat itself in different forms across the next 3 decades of this family's history. The institution wins, the individual pays, the children absorb the cost. For Frances, the loss of custody was not merely a legal defeat, it was a social sentence. In the world she had grown up in, among the families she had known her entire life, she was now the woman who had left her husband, taken up with another man, and lost her children. The fact that she had not abandoned them, that she had fought for custody, that she continued to fight for access, that she loved them and wanted them, did not survive the social narrative intact. The story that stuck, the story that the Fermoy and Spencer circles told, was simpler and crueler. She had bolted. She had chosen a man over her children. She was the bolter. That label, with its echoes of Nancy Mitford and a century of aristocratic mythology about women who could not stay, would follow Frances for the rest of her life. It was unfair. It was reductive. It was also, within the terms of her world, inescapable. Each of the Spencer children absorbed the cost of that world differently, and those differences would define their adult lives. Sarah, at 14, was old enough to understand the mechanics of what had happened, the affair, the court case, the grandmother's betrayal. And her response was a kind of fierce, defensive loyalty to her own survival. She would later develop difficulties of her own, including battles with eating and with relationships, but she would also develop a toughness that kept her, by and large, out of the public wreckage that consumed her younger sister. Jane, at 12, turned inward. She became the quiet one, the diplomatic one, the sister who sought stability in institutions rather than in rebellion. Her eventual marriage to Robert Fellows, a man who would become the Queen's private secretary, was not an accident of romantic attraction. It was, in psychological terms, a choice to move toward order, toward the palace's disciplined interior, toward the kind of structured hierarchical world where the rules were clear and the emotional surprises were minimal. Jane chose the system. She chose it deliberately, and she made it work. Diana, at 6, and Charles, at 3, were too young for strategy. They were young enough only for damage. Diana internalized the abandonment as a romantic wound. The mother who promised and did not return, the father who kept her but could not reach her, the house that was full of people and empty of warmth. She would carry that wound into every significant relationship of her life. Charles internalized it differently. He experienced the departure as a straightforward fact. The person who was supposed to protect him had gone, and the person who remained was not equipped to provide what she had taken with her. Charles and Diana became, in the aftermath, the pair, the two youngest, the ones who clung to each other because there was nobody else to cling to. That bond, unforged in the wreckage of a custody battle and tempered by years of shared institutional coldness, would survive everything that followed, including Diana's death. John Spencer, meanwhile, had won. He had his children. He had the moral narrative, the wronged husband, the stable home, the loyal father. He had the house, the title in waiting, the social position. He had Ruth Fermoy's endorsement, the court's approval, and the quiet satisfaction of a man whose world had confirmed that he was in the right. What he did not have was the ability to parent 4 children through the emotional devastation he had helped create. He could provide for them. He could house them, clothe them, educate them, present them to the world as properly maintained Spencer children. What he could not do was hold them. Not in the physical sense, though that too was apparently beyond him much of the time, but in the emotional sense. He could not sit with a crying child and say the thing that needed to be said. He could not acknowledge in words or in feeling that the household had been shattered and that the children inside it were frightened and bewildered and in pain. He had won the custody battle, and in winning it, he had taken on a responsibility that his entire upbringing had left him spectacularly unequipped to fulfill. The years between the divorce and John's accession to the earldom in 1975 were years of quiet, compounding damage, the kind of damage that does not announce itself at the time, but surfaces decades later in memoirs, in therapy rooms, in the patterns that repeat across a life. The children shuttled between their father's household and their mother's new life with Peter Shand Kidd. Frances married Peter in 1969 and moved eventually to a farm on the Isle of Seal, off the west coast of Scotland, a landscape of grey water and green hills, as far removed from the manicured lawns of the Sandringham estate as it was possible to get while remaining on the same island. Frances had chosen freedom, and freedom had taken her to the edge of Scotland, where the wind came off the sea and London society could not reach her, and her children came only in carefully allocated portions. The children visited her there, and in London, and at various points in between. But the custody arrangement meant that their primary home, their primary parent, their primary emotional environment was John. And John's emotional environment was one of order, restraint, and the quiet expectation that difficulty would be endured without discussion. The children endured. They went to school, boarding school in the English tradition, which meant that the already fractured family was further dispersed across the country, the children seeing their father during holidays and their mother during designated access periods, growing up in institutions rather than in a home. Diana was sent to Riddlesworth Hall, a preparatory school in Norfolk where she was remembered as a sweet, somewhat shy child who tried hard to please and cried at night when the lights went out. Later, she moved to West Heath, a girls' school in Kent, where she was not academically distinguished but was liked by her peers, showed a gift for caring for younger children, and carried herself with a warmth that teachers noticed and that classmates remembered long afterward. What none of them knew, what Diana herself may not have been able to articulate, was that the warmth was not merely a personality trait. It was a survival strategy. A child who has learned that love is conditional and can be withdrawn at any moment becomes often a child who works very hard to be lovable. Diana worked at it ceaselessly. She would never stop. Charles was sent to Maidwell Hall, a boys' preparatory school in Northamptonshire, at the age of 8. He was small, he was the youngest son of a broken household, and he was entering a world that operated on principles of hierarchy, physical toughness, and institutional obedience that made his father's emotional remoteness look almost tender by comparison. Charles would later describe his boarding school years in searing and specific detail in his 2024 memoir as a culture of cruelty and abuse, not merely the casual unkindness of children left to govern themselves, but a systematic environment in which older boys, and in some cases staff, inflicted physical and emotional damage on younger children with effective impunity. The schools were supposed to provide structure and continuity for children whose home life could not. They provided distance. They provided for Charles in particular a second layer of abandonment laid on top of the first, a world where the adults who were supposed to protect you either could not or would not, which was, of course, exactly the lesson he had already learned at home. And through all of this, the shuttling, the schools, the holidays that were never quite long enough and never quite warm enough, the careful arrangements that kept four children circulating between two households that could not speak to each other, Althorp waited. The great house in Northamptonshire, with its 13,000 acres and its 5 centuries of Spencer history and its rooms full of art and its corridors full of ancestral portraits, waited for the 7th Earl to die and the 8th Earl to take his place. John's father, Albert, was aging. The inheritance was approaching, and with it would come everything. The death duties, estimated later at roughly £2.25 million. The running costs, the responsibility for the house, the staff, the tenants, the collections, and the move from Park House, which was after all merely rented from the Crown estate, into the ancestral seat itself. The children would leave Norfolk. They would leave the place where their mother had once lived, the place where the family had once been whole, the place where Diana had waited on the doorstep, and they would enter the house that had been shaping Spencer's for 500 years, and that house would shape them too. In 1975, Albert Spencer, the 7th Earl, died. John inherited the title. He became the 8th Earl Spencer. Diana, at 14, became Lady Diana Spencer, a title that would, within 6 years, become the most recognizable name in British public life. Charles, at 11, became Viscount Althorp, carrying the courtesy title that marked him as the heir to the heir. The family moved into the great house. Althorp opened its doors to a new generation, the same corridors, the same portraits, the same weight of expectation that had pressed down on every Spencer who had lived there before them, now pressing down on a man who had spent the last decade managing a broken household with the emotional tools of a previous century. And with the title came the bill. The death duties that accompanied the 7th Earl's estate were, by the biographical estimates later published, in the region of £2.25 million, a sum that would have been crushing for most families and that was merely crippling for the Spencers. The running costs of Althorp itself were estimated at roughly £80,000 per year. The house was magnificent and it was a trap. It demanded constant money, constant attention, constant stewardship, and it offered in return the prestige of ownership and the slow, grinding anxiety of wondering whether the money would last. John had the house now. He had the name. He had the children. He had everything his father and his father's father and every Spencer before them had worked to build and maintain. What he did not have, and what no title or estate or act of parliament could provide, was the capacity to be the father those children needed. The machine had produced its heir. The heir had produced his heir. The chain was unbroken, and inside the chain 4 children were learning, in their different ways, that continuity and care were not the same thing. The earldom had arrived. Althorp had opened its doors to a family that was already broken, and somehow, for the people who mattered most, the 4 children who had not asked for any of this, everything was about to get considerably worse. Althorp in 1975 was a house that had been waiting for its moment and a family that had already passed theirs. The 13,000 acres were magnificent. The rooms were full of art that had taken centuries to collect. Paintings by Rubens, Van Dyck, Reynolds, Gainsborough, hung in galleries that generations of Spencers had curated with the dedication of a family that understood beauty as both inheritance and obligation. The long library was one of the finest private rooms in England. The stables were extensive. The grounds, shaped and reshaped by the fashions of successive centuries, stretched out in every direction, from the house, like the physical expression of a family's reach. And at the center of it all stood John Spencer, the new 8th Earl, 51 years old, divorced, emotionally closed, financially burdened by the death duties that accompanied his father's estate, and responsible for 4 children whose interior lives he could not access, and a household he was not equipped to run alone. For the children, the move from Park House to Althorp was a dislocation wrapped in an upgrade. Park House had been their home. The place where the family had been whole, however briefly, the place where the early happiness had existed, the place saturated with the memory of their mother. Leaving it meant leaving Norfolk, leaving Sandringham, leaving the proximity to the royal children who had been their neighbors and playmates. Arriving at Althorp meant entering a house of a different order entirely. Grander, colder, more imposing, more obviously a monument to a family's history than a place where a family actually lived. The corridors were longer, the rooms were larger. The portraits on the walls were not decorations. They were ancestors watching. For Diana, who was 14 and already carrying the accumulated weight of her mother's departure, her father's emotional absence, and the general atmosphere of a childhood that had been rearranged too many times, Althorp was both impressive and alienating. For Charles, at 11, it was the house he would one day own, a fact that made it simultaneously his inheritance and his burden, the place he would spend his adult life maintaining, just as his father was now maintaining it, just as his grandfather had maintained it before that. The chain of custodianship stretched backward and forward, and Charles, whether he wanted it or not, was the next link. The financial pressure was immediate and unrelenting. The death duties, estimated at roughly £2.25 million, landed on the estate like a second inheritance, one made entirely of debt. The running costs were approximately £80,000 a year, a figure that covered the staff, the maintenance, the heating of a house that had never been designed with economy in mind, and the upkeep of an agricultural estate that generated income but not enough to offset the constant hemorrhage of maintaining a property of that scale. John's response was to sell. Over the years that followed, pieces of the Spencer collection, paintings, furniture, objects that had been at Althorp for generations, were dispersed to meet the financial demands. Each sale was a small amputation. Each one reduced the house that the next generation would inherit. The children, watching from the margins, understood this in different ways. Sarah and Jane, older and more attuned to the adult world, grasped the financial mechanics. Diana and Charles, younger and less interested in estate management, experienced the sales as something vaguer, but no less disturbing. The sense that the house was being diminished, that things were disappearing, that the world their father had inherited was already beginning to contract around him. But the sales were not the thing that changed the household most profoundly. The thing that changed the household was a woman. Rayne McCorquodale, formerly the Countess of Dartmouth, entered John Spencer's life sometime in the mid-1970s, and her arrival detonated a second crisis inside a family that had barely survived the first. Rayne was, by any measure, a remarkable figure. She was born Rayne Legge in 1929, the daughter of the romance novelist Barbara Cartland, a fact that would later become a source of both fascination and derision in the press, and she had built a career that combined social ambition with political competence. She had served as a Westminster city councillor, sat on the London County Council, and chaired the board of the English Tourist Board. She was glamorous in a way that was specific to her era and her class. Lacquered hair, bold colors, a voice that carried across any room, and a manner that combined charm with an absolute refusal to be ignored. She had been married to Gerald Legge, the 9th Earl of Dartmouth, with whom she had 4 children, and when that marriage ended, she turned her considerable energies toward John Spencer. Whether John pursued Rayne or Rayne pursued John, or whether, as is usually the case in such matters, the pursuit was mutual and the motivations were tangled, the result was a relationship that the Spencer children experienced as an invasion. John married Rayne in 1976 in a ceremony at Caxton Hall, a London register office. He did not invite his children. He did not, according to the accounts that the children later gave, even tell them in advance. They learned of the marriage after it had happened. Diana was 15 years old, Charles was 12, Sarah was 21, Jane was 19. Each of them was confronted with the same fact. Their father had married a woman they did not know in a ceremony they were not asked to attend without the courtesy of a conversation beforehand. The message, whether John intended it or not, was clear. This was his decision. Their feelings were not a factor. Diana's response, according to later accounts drawing on multiple sources, was direct and physical. She confronted her father. She slapped him. Whether the slap happened exactly as described, in the heat of the moment, face to face, a 15-year-old girl striking her own father, or whether the detail has been burnished by decades of retelling, the emotional truth behind it is not in dispute. Diana was furious. She felt betrayed. She felt once again that a parent had chosen someone else over her. The mother had left for Peter Shen Kidd, Now the father had chosen Rain. The pattern was crystallizing. The adults in Diana's life kept reaching past her towards something or someone they wanted more. That pattern would define her understanding of love for the rest of her life. The other children's responses were less dramatic, but no less revealing. Sarah, the eldest, settled into a cold hostility toward Rain that would persist for years. Jane withdrew further into her own quiet orbit, managing the situation by managing her distance from it. Charles, the youngest, absorbed the new marriage as yet another betrayal in a childhood that had become, by this point, a sequence of them. The mother's departure, the custody battle, the boarding school, and now this. The children collectively gave Rain a nickname that captured their feelings with adolescent precision. Acid Rain. The name stuck. It followed her through the Spencer household, through the London gossip columns, and through the decades that followed. It was cruel. It was also, from the children's perspective, earned. What Rain did to Althorp became a source of particular anguish, and in time, a source of genuine anger that went beyond adolescent resentment into something harder and more justified. She redecorated. She brought in her own taste, a taste that ran toward guilt, opulence, and a kind of theatrical grandeur that the Spencer children, raised in the quieter, more austere aesthetic of their father and grandfather, found physically offensive. Rooms that had looked one way for generations suddenly looked another. Furniture was moved. Color schemes were changed. Carpets were replaced. The house, which the children already experienced as an inherited responsibility and an emotional battleground, was now being reshaped by a woman they regarded as an interloper. But the redecoration was only part of it. Under Rain's influence, or at least during her tenure as the Earl's wife, the boundary between influence and coincidence being impossible to draw with certainty, more pieces of the Spencer collection were sold. Paintings left the walls. Objects that had been catalogued and cared for across centuries were dispersed through auction houses and private sales. The children saw this not as financial necessity, which it partly was, but as desecration. The house was being stripped. The inheritance was being diminished. And their father, the man whose duty it was to protect the estate for the next generation, was either unable or unwilling to stop it. That was perhaps the most painful element of Rain's presence. Not what she did, but what John allowed. He had chosen this woman. He had married her without telling his children. He had led her into the house and let her change it. Every gilded curtain rail and every soul painting was, in the children's eyes, evidence of their father's final betrayal. Not the dramatic kind, not the slap-worthy kind, but the slow grinding kind, where the person who is supposed to protect what belongs to you watches while someone else takes it apart. And then, because this family's story permits almost no interval of stability, the next catastrophe arrived. It arrived not as a scandal or a departure, but as a medical event, sudden and irrevocable, that changed John Spencer in ways from which he would never fully recover. In September 1978, John suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke so severe that he was not expected to survive. He was 54 years old. He collapsed at Althorp and was rushed to hospital, where the initial prognosis was dire. The family was cold. The children gathered, or tried to gather, dispersed as they were across boarding schools and London flats and the various outposts of their separated lives in the particular atmosphere of medical crisis that strips away all pretense and reduces a family to its most basic components: fear, proximity, and the knowledge that the person in the bed may not be there tomorrow. The hospital became, for several weeks, the center of the Spencer world. John was unconscious, then semi-conscious, then in a condition that the doctors described in terms that offered hope without promising recovery. The children came and went. Frances, the ex-wife, was informed but had no formal role. Ruth Fermoy, aging now and increasingly peripheral, watched from whatever distance the family's fractured geometry allowed, and Rain took charge. Whatever the children thought of her, and they thought very little that was kind, Rain's behavior during John's illness was, by most accounts, extraordinary in its ferocity and its dedication. She was at his bedside constantly. She fought with doctors over his treatment, challenging their decisions with a combativeness that medical staff found difficult and the family found characteristic. She researched his condition with the single-mindedness of a woman who refused to accept the prognosis she had been given. She is credited, in some accounts, with insisting on an experimental drug called acetylcysteine that may have contributed to his survival, though the medical evidence for this claim is contested and the truth may be simpler than the mythology suggests. What is not contested is that Rain fought for John's life with a tenacity that nobody else in the family matched, and that her efforts complicated the narrative the children had built around her. She was the usurper. She was the woman who had stolen their father and their house. She was also the woman who may have saved their father's life. Those two facts coexisted uneasily, and neither one canceled the other out. The children did not forgive Rain for the marriage, or for the redecoration, or for the sales, or for the way she had interposed herself between them and their father. But they could not deny that when the crisis came, she was the one who was there. That knowledge must have been, in its own way, as painful as the resentment it complicated. John survived, but the man who emerged from that hospital was not the man who had entered it. The stroke altered him. Physically, he was diminished, slower, frailer, visibly aged by an event that had taken him to the boundary between life and death and brought him back changed. The tall, upright figure who had walked through Eton and Sandhurst and the corridors of Buckingham Palace now moved with the caution of a man whose body had betrayed him. His speech was affected. His energy was reduced. The easy social presence that had been his primary tool for navigating the world was blunted. But it was the cognitive and emotional changes that mattered most to the people who lived with him. By the accounts of those who knew him before and after, the stroke made John more distant than he had already been. The emotional remoteness that had always been part of his character, the product of his upbringing, his class, his temperament, deepened into something harder and stranger. He was present in the house. He was present at the dinner table. He was present in the lives of his children in the mechanical sense that a father who lives in the same country and holds the same title is present. But the already narrow channel through which affection or understanding might have passed between John and his children narrowed further. Diana later described her father, in retellings that reached the public through Andrew Morton and other intermediaries, as estranged but adoring, a phrase that captures something precise and painful about a man who loved his children, but had no way of showing them that he did. The household after the stroke was Rain's household. She had nursed John through the crisis. She had earned, in her own estimation, and perhaps in his, the right to run the domestic world as she saw fit. The children were pushed further to the periphery. Visits to Althorp became exercises in navigating Rain's territory. Conversations with their father were mediated, whether deliberately or not, by the presence of a woman they resented. The distance between John and his children, which had been emotional before the stroke, became almost architectural. There were rooms Rain occupied, schedules Rain managed, decisions Rain made, and the children found themselves increasingly on the outside of a household that bore their name but was no longer governed by their family's rhythms. And while the household contracted around John and Rain, the children's lives were diverging, each one moving along a trajectory that the family's dysfunction had set in motion years earlier. But that was now accelerating toward destinations none of them could have predicted. Sarah, the eldest, had moved through her 20s with the complicated confidence of a woman who had inherited her mother's vitality and her father's social position, but neither parent's capacity for sustained stability. She had struggled with anorexia, a fact that became public knowledge when she spoke about it to a journalist in 1978, in a disclosure that was remarkably candid for a woman of her background and era, and that suggested a relationship with control and self-punishment that bore the fingerprints of the family she had grown up in. She had dated the Prince of Wales himself briefly before the relationship ended. Partly it was reported because Sarah spoke to the press about it, which violated the unwritten rules of royal courtship with a directness that was pure Spencer. The irony that Sarah's relationship with the prince ended just as Diana's was about to begin was not lost on the family, though it was handled with the silence that such ironies demanded. Sarah would later say that she had introduced Diana and Charles. Whether that claim is precisely accurate or whether it is a convenient narrative that assigned agency to a process driven by larger forces, it places Sarah at the hinge of the most consequential Spencer event of the century. and then immediately outside it, watching from the margin as her younger sister stepped into a spotlight that would never find Sarah herself. Her trajectory was not dramatic in the way that Diana's would become. It was the quieter story of a woman who survived her family's wreckage through toughness, through social competence, and through the decision, conscious or otherwise, to live her life at a lower volume than the name Spencer would eventually demand. Jane had made the most strategically astute decision of any Spencer child. In 1978, the same year as John's stroke, she married Robert Fellows, a career courtier 13 years her senior, who was already rising through the private secretary's office at Buckingham Palace. Robert was the son of Sir William Fellows, the Queen's land agent at Sandringham, which meant that Jane was marrying not a stranger to the royal orbit, but someone who had grown up inside it, someone who understood its protocols and its silences with the same instinctive fluency that Jane herself had developed for navigating difficult institutional environments. The marriage was, in one sense, a love match. In another, deeper sense, it was a survival strategy. Jane moved from a household governed by her father's emotional incapacity and Rain's domestic tyranny into a household governed by the palace's calm, hierarchical discipline. She traded one institution for another, and the second institution, whatever its limitations, at least operated on rules she could learn and follow. Robert Fellows would eventually become the Queen's private secretary, the most senior position in the royal household, and Jane would spend decades inside the palace machinery. A Spencer daughter who had chosen the institution over rebellion. That choice would place her in an extraordinary position when her younger sister's marriage to the Prince of Wales began to unravel. Jane would be inside the palace, serving the crown, while Diana was outside it, fighting for her life. That conflict lay years in the future, but the architecture of it was being built now, in the late 1970s, as each Spencer daughter chose her path, and the paths began to diverge irrevocably. Diana, at 17 and then 18, was becoming something that nobody in the family had anticipated and that the public had not yet noticed. Beautiful, shy, romantically unattached, and positioned by geography, by title, by social connection, by a combination of accident and design that the Spencer family could not have orchestrated if they had tried. As a plausible candidate for the most significant marriage in British public life, she had left Westheath without academic distinction. She had spent a brief period at a finishing school in Switzerland, the Institut Alpin Wiedemannet, which she disliked and left after a single term. She had moved to London, to a flat in Coleherne Court in Earl's Court that she shared with 3 friends, and she was working as a nursery assistant at the Young England kindergarten in Pimlico. A young woman of good family doing the kind of gentle, child-centered work that suited her temperament and that would, within 2 years, become the most analyzed biographical detail in the country. She was Lady Diana Spencer. She was the daughter of the 8th Earl. She was 19 years old. She was beautiful in a way that combined vulnerability with physical presence. Tall, with a slight downward tilt of the head, that reddish shyness, blue eyes that the cameras would fall in love with before the public did. And she was, in the language of the world she inhabited, available. The Prince of Wales was looking for a wife. He was 32. He had been through a series of relationships that the press had documented with increasing impatience. The requirements were specific and, by the standards of the modern world, almost medievally rigid. The future queen consort needed to be of suitable family, of impeccable reputation, of the right religious denomination, and, though this was not stated explicitly, of an age and disposition that suggested malleability. Diana met every criterion. She was aristocratic. She was Church of England. She was young enough to be shaped by the institution she was entering. She was crucially a Spencer, a name that carried the right weight in the right circles, and she wanted with every fiber of her being to be chosen. The courtship was brief, conducted under growing media scrutiny, and driven by forces that had far more to do with institutional requirements than with the kind of intimacy that sustains a marriage. Diana later said that she had been in love with the idea of being in love. The prince, by his own subsequent admission, was uncertain, but the machinery moved forward. The engagement was announced, the ring was produced, and the Spencer family found itself at the center of the most public event in British life since the coronation. What nobody understood yet, what perhaps nobody could have understood, because understanding it would have required knowing everything this story has already told you about Park House, about the doorstep, about the dead brother, about the custody battle, about the father who could not reach his children. Was that Diana's hunger for love, her desperate need to be chosen, her lifelong search for the warmth that her own family had failed to provide, would make her simultaneously the most compelling and the most vulnerable person to place at the center of the British monarchy. She was walking into the palace the way her mother had once walked into Park House. Young, hopeful, radiantly alive, and completely unprepared for what the institution would demand of her. Charles, meanwhile, was 14 years old in 1978 and then 15, 16, 17, moving through the boarding school system that he would later describe as the most formative and the most damaging experience of his young life. He was the heir, the boy whose birth had justified years of dynastic pressure, whose existence had solved the succession problem but not the family problem, whose childhood had been parceled out between a remote father, an exiled mother, a resented stepmother, and a sequence of institution that taught him, above all, that the adults in charge of his welfare could not be trusted to protect him. At Maidwell Hall, and then at his subsequent schools, Charles experienced a world that operated on hierarchies of physical dominance and emotional suppression, a world where vulnerability was punished, where homesickness was pathologized, where the things that had happened to him at home were not discussed because the culture of English boarding schools in that era did not permit the discussion of such things. You endured, you adapted, you learned the rules of the institution, and you survived within them. And if the institution damaged you, if the older boys hurt you, if the staff ignored what was happening, if the loneliness became something that lived inside your chest, like a permanent resident, then you carried that damage quietly, because that was what was expected. Charles was absorbing everything. He was watching his father diminish after the stroke, watching the once imposing man shuffle through the corridors of a house that now belonged, in all but legal title, to Rain. He was watching Rain sell the paintings and redecorate the rooms of the house he would one day inherit, and he was powerless to stop it. He was watching his sister Diana attract a kind of public attention that would soon eclipse everything else the Spencer name had ever produced. And he was old enough to sense, though perhaps not yet old enough to articulate, that the attention Diana was receiving had very little to do with who she actually was, and everything to do with what the country wanted her to be. And he was storing it all: the abandonment, the cruelty, the institutional failures, the emotional absences, the specific incidents, and the general atmosphere, in a place deep enough that it would not be opened for decades until he sat down in his 50s to write a memoir that would lay the whole edifice bare. By the early 1980s, the Spencer family had arrived at a position that, viewed from outside, looked like the summit of everything they had spent 5 centuries building. John was the Earl. Althorp was maintained, if barely. The heir existed and was growing toward adulthood. The daughters were married or marrying into the establishment, Jane into the palace, Sarah into a quieter life of her own, and Diana, the girl who had waited on a doorstep for a mother who never came back, the girl who had been blindsided by her father's secret marriage, the girl who had grown up inside a household where love was conditional and presence was unreliable. Diana was about to become the Princess of Wales. On the 29th of July, 1981, John Spencer walked his youngest daughter up the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral in front of 750 million television viewers worldwide. It was the wedding of the century. The cathedral was full of dignitaries, heads of state, royalty from across Europe, and the concentrated social power of the British establishment at its most ceremonial. Outside, the crowd stretched along the procession route. Inside, the music soared. The flowers banked the altar, and Diana moved through the nave in a dress of ivory silk taffeta with a 25-foot train that seemed designed to fill as much space as possible, as though the spectacle itself could compensate for whatever was missing underneath. John was 57 years old. He had survived a stroke that should have killed him 3 years earlier. He moved slowly. His gait was careful, measured, the walk of a man whose body had once betrayed him catastrophically, and who could not entirely trust it not to do so again. He gripped Diana's arm. He held himself upright, and in that moment, broadcast to more human beings than had ever simultaneously witnessed a single event. He was the picture of paternal dignity, A father giving away his daughter to the future King of England, an earl performing the role that the Spencer system had prepared him for across a lifetime of duty, service, and unquestioning correctness. The image was global. The image was beautiful. The image was, in almost every way that mattered, a lie. Behind that slow, careful walk up the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral was a household in ruins, a first wife exiled to Scotland and socially destroyed, a second wife despised by the children she lived alongside, a son in boarding school absorbing damage he would not understand for decades, daughters scattered across different survival strategies, and a patriarch whose capacity for fatherhood had been diminished first by temperament, then by divorce, then by remarriage, and finally by a stroke that had left him physically and emotionally more remote than ever. John Spencer was walking his daughter into an institution, the British monarchy, that would demand from Diana the same things his own family had demanded from Francis: compliance, reproduction, silence, and the subordination of personal need to institutional requirement. He was handing his daughter to a system, and the system would break her just as it had broken her mother before her. But none of that was visible on the 29th of July. On the 29th of July, it was just a father and his daughter walking slowly up an aisle and the whole world watching. The family had everything it had ever wanted on paper: the title, the house, the heir, and now a princess. And this was exactly the moment when the emotional debt, accumulated across decades of silence, custody battles, strokes, secret marriages, soul paintings, and children who were maintained but never held, started coming due. The 1980s should have been the decade in which the Spencer family finally settled into the kind of quiet, well-maintained aristocratic existence that 5 centuries of careful construction had been designed to produce. The Earl was in his house. The heir was growing up. The daughters were established. The most famous Spencer of all was now a member of the royal family, her face on every magazine cover and every newspaper front page in the English-speaking world. The name had never been more prominent, never more recognizable, never more present in the public consciousness. The family had never been more fractured. Diana's marriage to the Prince of Wales began to fail almost immediately, and the failure was both deeply private and relentlessly public. The details of that failure belong more properly to Diana's own story than to her father's. But the Spencer dimension cannot be separated from it entirely, because the patterns Diana brought into the palace, the hunger for love, the terror of abandonment, the desperate need to be chosen and kept and held, were patterns that had been forged at Park House and tempered at Althorp. She had married a man who could not give her what she needed, just as her mother had married a man who could not give her what she needed. And the institutional response in both cases was the same. The woman's unhappiness was treated as a problem to be managed rather than a pain to be addressed. The palace closed around Diana the way Sandringham had closed around Francis. And Diana, like Francis before her, began looking for a way out. Though in Diana's case, the way out would be public, spectacular, and ultimately fatal. John watched this from Althorp, or rather, John existed at Althorp while it happened. His capacity to intervene in Diana's life, to offer her the kind of fatherly counsel or emotional support that might have made a difference, was limited by the stroke, by Rain's management of the household, by his own temperamental inability to discuss feelings, and by the simple fact that the royal family did not welcome outside interference in matters it considered internal. Diana was inside the palace. John was outside it. The distance between them was not merely geographical, it was institutional, emotional, and after the stroke, almost physical. Diana later described her father, through intermediaries and in the coded language she used when discussing her childhood, as someone she loved but could not reach. A man who was adoring in his way, but whose way was so constrained by class, by illness, and by his own emotional limitations, that the adoration never translated into the kind of active, present, protective fatherhood she craved. John Spencer loved Diana. That much seems clear from everything the family has said. But love in the Spencer world was not the same as closeness. Love could coexist with distance, with silence, with the total inability to sit in a room with your daughter and ask her how she was. And for Diana, who needed to be asked more than almost anything else, that gap between loving and reaching was the gap that defined her relationship with her father. The household at Althorp through the 1980s was Rain's domain. She managed the house, she managed the staff, she managed John's social calendar, and to a significant extent, his access to his own children. The Spencer children visited, but the visits were fraught, shaped by the knowledge that they were entering territory that had been claimed by someone they regarded as an enemy. The atmosphere was one of barely suppressed hostility, punctuated by moments of open confrontation. The children were civil when they had to be and hostile when they could not contain it. Rain, for her part, showed no sign of retreating. She had married John Spencer. She had saved his life during the stroke. She had earned, in her own reckoning, the right to run the household as she saw fit. And if the children did not like it, that was their problem rather than hers. The confrontation that had been building for years, simmering through every awkward dinner, every cold visit, every resentful holiday, finally erupted in physical form in 1989 at an event that should have been a celebration. Charles Spencer was getting married at Althorp, the heir marrying Victoria Lockwood in a ceremony at the family estate. The wedding brought the entire Spencer family together in one place, which meant it brought together the children and reigned Francis and John, the ex-wife and the current wife. The whole combustible chemistry of the family's unresolved grievances concentrated inside the very house that symbolized everything they were fighting over. According to accounts that emerged afterward, an argument broke out between Diana and Rain. The subject, by most tellings, was the treatment of Frances, the exiled first wife, the children's mother, the woman who had been erased from the family's domestic life and who was now present at her son's wedding in a house she had once been expected to call home. The argument escalated, and then on the staircase at Althorp, the grand staircase, the kind of architectural feature that English country houses build as statements of permanence and power, Diana pushed Rain. Whether the push was a shove, a physical confrontation, or something more ambiguous depends on who is telling the story. What is not ambiguous is the emotional content of the moment. A daughter in her father's house, at her brother's wedding, confronted the woman she held responsible for the pillaging of her family home and the displacement of her mother, and she acted. It was not reason. It was not strategic. It was the physical expression of years and decades of accumulated fury, the kind of fury that builds in families where grievances are endured rather than addressed, where the code of behavior demands silence and the heart demands a reckoning. Diana pushed Rain on the staircase at Althorp, and in that moment, the Spencer family's long habit of managing its conflicts through propriety and silence broke down entirely. The opera of it, the grand house, the staircase, the wedding, the princess and the stepmother, the exiled mother somewhere in the background, was almost too perfectly constructed to be believed. But it happened. And it happened because every unresolved wound in the family, from Francis's departure in 1967 to Rain's arrival in 1976, to the stroke in 1978, to the soul paintings and the redecorated rooms and the father who could not protect what his children needed protecting, had finally found its flashpoint. John Spencer, in the aftermath of the staircase incident, did what John Spencer always did. He absorbed it. He did not confront the situation. He did not mediate between his daughter and his wife. He did not ask Diana why she was so angry, or ask Rain what she had done to provoke such anger, or ask himself what his role was in a family that had reached the point of physical confrontation at a wedding. He endured it, as he had endured everything: the divorce, the custody battle, the stroke, the remarriage, the slow accumulation of his children's resentment. Endurance was the only tool he had. It was the only tool the Spencer system had given him. And by 1989, it was no longer enough. The years between the staircase incident and John's death were years of visible decline, a slow diminishment that was painful to watch and that the Spencer code of behavior made it impossible to discuss. The stroke had taken a permanent toll. John was in his mid-60s, but looked and moved like a man considerably older. His health was fragile in the way that the health of stroke survivors often is. Not a single dramatic condition, but a general erosion, a body that had been damaged once, and that now carried the damage forward into every subsequent illness, every winter cold, every bout of fatigue. He walked the corridors of Althorp with the careful, measured gait of a man who no longer trusted his own body. He appeared at public events. The local civic functions, the church services, the estate occasions that an earl was expected to attend, with a diminished version of the social ease that had once been his most visible quality. He was still polite, he was still correct, but the animation was gone, replaced by a kind of careful, watchful stillness that people who knew him before the stroke found unsettling, and people who knew him only after it accepted as simply who he was. Rain continued to manage the household with the same combination of energy and control that had characterized her entire tenure. She was, in a sense, more essential than ever. John needed managing now, physically as well as socially, and Rain provided that management with the same forceful competence she brought to everything. The children continued to visit or not visit according to the complicated emotional calculus that governed each of their relationships with their father. A visit to Althorp meant navigating Rain. It meant sitting in rooms that had been redecorated beyond recognition. It meant trying to reach a father who was physically present and emotionally inaccessible. And it meant doing all of this while suppressing the resentment that had been building since the mid 70s. Some visits were better than others. None of them, by any account, were easy. Diana's marriage was now in open crisis. The separation from Prince Charles would come in 1992, the same year as John's death, a coincidence of timing so cruel that it seems designed to illustrate the principle that in this family, calamity never arrived alone. Diana was fighting for survival inside the palace while her father was declining at Althorp, and neither of them could help the other because neither of them had ever been given the tools to try. In the early months of 1992, John fell ill with pneumonia. At 68, with his post-stroke constitution already compromised, the illness was serious from the outset. He was admitted to the Humana Wellington Hospital in St. John's Wood, North London, a private hospital in a quiet, affluent neighborhood where the kind of care that money and title could provide was readily available, where the rooms were clean and the staff were experienced and discreet, and the family could come and go without navigating the public gaze that attended everything connected to the Princess of Wales. The initial prognosis was concerning but not immediately fatal. Pneumonia in a man of John's age and medical history was dangerous, certainly, but it was treatable. The doctors were cautious. The antibiotics were administered. The family was informed. The news spread through the Spencer network in the way that such news always spreads in families that are geographically dispersed and emotionally fragmented. Telephone calls, relayed messages, the gradual assembly of concern that accompanies a parent's serious illness. Plans were adjusted. Diaries were rearranged. The machinery of worry that surrounds a seriously ill patriarch began to turn. Discussions about visiting schedules, about prognosis, about the practical arrangements that nobody wants to make, but everybody knows may become necessary. There was the particular quality of suspended animation that attends a hospital vigil, the sense that normal life has been interrupted by something that demands attention, but that cannot be resolved by anything the family does, that the outcome rests with the doctors and the patient's body and forces entirely beyond the family's control. And beneath the worry, beneath the logistics, beneath the conversations between siblings about who would visit when, there was something else. The unspoken knowledge, held differently by each of the children, that their relationship with their father had never been what they needed it to be, and that the time remaining to change, that was running out. John appeared to improve. The pneumonia responded to treatment. There were days when he seemed stronger, when the color returned to his face, when the doctors spoke in terms that suggested recovery was probable rather than merely possible, when the family allowed itself to step back from the edge of grief and believed that the crisis had passed. Rain was present at the hospital, as she had been present during every previous crisis, attentive, forceful, refusing to be excluded from the medical conversation, demanding information from the staff with the same determination she had shown during the stroke 14 years earlier. She knew how to do this. She had practice. The children were scattered, as they always were, pulled in different directions by their own lives, their own families, their own obligations. Diana was away from London entirely, on a family ski holiday in Lech, Austria, with Prince Charles and their sons, William and Harry. The holiday was itself a performance, the appearance of a functional royal marriage maintained for the cameras and for the children, even as the relationship behind the facade was in its final stages of disintegration. Sarah and Jane were managing their own lives, their own families, their own complicated relationships with a father they had loved from a distance for most of their adult years. Charles, the heir, was in England and was available, but not, it seems, at the hospital at the moment when availability mattered most. What happened next happened quickly. On the 29th of March, 1992, a Sunday, John Spencer suffered a sudden heart attack at the Humana Wellington Hospital. He had seemed to be recovering. The pneumonia had been the presenting crisis, and the presenting crisis appeared to be receding. The family had been told to be cautiously optimistic. The worst, it seemed, had passed. And then, in the way that the worst sometimes reasserts itself when defenses are lowered, his heart failed. It failed without warning, without the gradual worsening that might have given the family time to gather, without the ominous change in vital signs that might have prompted a nurse to make an urgent telephone call, without the dramatic bedside scene that fiction provides and that reality, in its blunt indifference to narrative, almost never does. One moment, John Spencer was a patient recovering from pneumonia in a private hospital room in North London. The next moment, he was dying. The medical team responded. They did what medical teams do when a patient's heart stops. The compressions, the drugs, the controlled urgency of a resuscitation attempt. It was not enough. John Spencer, the 8th Earl Spencer, former equerry to two sovereigns, war veteran, master of Althorp, father of the Princess of Wales, died in his hospital room on a Sunday afternoon. He was 68 years old. Nobody was with him when he died. That sentence requires a moment of stillness. It requires you to hold it and feel its weight before the story can continue. Nobody was with him. Not Rain, who had nursed him through the stroke and fought for his life with the ferocity of a woman who refused to accept losing. Not Sarah, the eldest daughter, who had known him longest. Not Jane, who had navigated his household with such quiet care. Not Charles, the heir, the son whose entire existence had been the point of the Spencer succession plan. Not Diana, who was in Austria, on a ski slope or in a hotel room, thousands of miles from the hospital where her father's heart was stopping. Nobody. The 8th Earl Spencer died alone in a hospital room in St. John's Wood, London, on a quiet Sunday, while the world continued its business outside. Charles Spencer later told reporters that no family member was present at the moment of death. That detail, the absence, the empty room, the solitary ending, is the emotional fulcrum of this entire story. It is the detail that transforms John Spencer's death from a biographical fact into a judgment on everything his life had produced. A man who had spent decades organizing possession of his wife, his children, his house, his title, his place in the social order, could not control the final separation. A man who had won a custody battle to keep his children close died without a single one of them in the room. A man who had devoted his life to continuity, the preservation of the house, the production of the heir, the maintenance of the unbroken chains Thyssen, ended that life in the most discontinuous way possible, alone in a hospital bed, while the machinery of his family continued to turn elsewhere, each member occupied with their own obligations, their own crises, their own versions of the life his choices had made for them. There is something about a death that happens on a Sunday that makes the aloneness worse. Hospitals on Sundays are quieter than hospitals on weekdays. The corridors are emptier. The staff are fewer. The visitors who fill the rooms during the week, the colleagues, the friends, the distant relations who come out of duty or affection, are at home living their weekend lives. A Sunday death happens in the margins, in the quiet gap between one week and the next, and it carries with it the sense that the world was not paying attention when it should have been. John Spencer's death on a Sunday afternoon had that quality. It was not witnessed. It was not expected. It was not, in the immediate moment, even known. He died, and for some period of time, minutes, perhaps longer, nobody outside that hospital room was aware that the 8th Earl Spencer was gone. The telephone calls went out, Rain was informed or summoned or arrived to be told what had already happened. The accounts differ, and the precise sequence matters less than the fact that by the time any family member reached the hospital, John was already dead. The children were called one by one, each of them receiving the news in a different location, at a different point in their day, carrying a different version of the relationship that had just ended permanently. Sarah heard the news. Jane heard. Charles heard. And with that telephone call, the 27-year-old who had spent his childhood being shuttled between boarding schools and broken households became, in the space of a single sentence spoken down a telephone line, the ninth Earl Spencer, the master of Althorp, the inheritor of everything his father had been and everything his father had failed to be. And Diana, in Lech, on the ski slopes or in the hotel or somewhere in the Austrian Alps, where the news would have arrived with the particular cruelty of distance, the knowledge that it was already too late, that there was no flight fast enough, no car quick enough, no way to undo the fact that her father was dead and she had not been there. Dinah heard. Each of them absorbed the news as they had absorbed every other Spencer crisis, separately, in the privacy of their own grief, shaped by the particular version of their relationship with their father that each of them carried. For Sarah, the loss was of the man she had known longest and perhaps understood most clearly. The distant, correct, socially presentable father who had kept his children clothed and housed and educated without ever managing to make them feel emotionally safe. For Jane, it was the loss of the patriarch, whose household she had navigated with such diplomatic care. The man she had observed with the quiet intelligence of a middle daughter who understood the family dynamics better than anyone, but who had chosen wisely to manage them rather than confront them. For Charles, it was the loss of the man who had wanted him more than anything, the heir, the dynastic solution, the boy whose birth was supposed to fix everything, and who had then been unable to give him the one thing that being wanted should have provided, the feeling of being truly held. And for Diana, the loss was perhaps the most complex of all. She lost the father she had yearned for all her life, the father who had been estranged but adoring, the father who had walked her up the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral in front of 750 million people, and who had never, in her entire life, managed to walk into a room and sit down beside her and ask her simply how she was. She lost the possibility that he might still someday become the father she needed. That possibility, the hope that a distant parent will one day close the distance, is the cruelest thing a child can lose, because losing it means accepting that the gap was permanent, that it was never going to be bridged, and that the love that existed on the other side of it was real, but would never be enough. Diana returned from Letts to London. The return journey was its own kind of ordeal. A princess in grief, moving through airports and transfer lounges and the logistics of international travel in the numbed, dislocated state that follows sudden bereavement, all of it overlaid with the additional, inescapable weight of being the most photographed woman on earth, of being recognized, of being watched even in grief. She came back to a London of black cars and hospital paperwork and grey march streets and the administrative machinery that accompanies death in families of this kind. The solicitors, the estate managers, the palace officials who needed to be notified, the press that would report the death with the dutiful solemnity reserved for the fathers of princesses. She returned to a family that had been pulled apart by decades of dysfunction and that was now being pulled together, temporarily and uncomfortably, by the only force powerful enough to override their accumulated estrangements, the death of the man who had caused most of them. John Spencer's body was taken from the hospital to Althorp. The funeral arrangements began, and the quiet, competent mobilization of an aristocratic household, preparing to bury its patriarch. There would be a service. There would be mourners. There would be the rituals that the Church of England provides for the dead, and that the English upper class performs with the same controlled precision it brings to weddings and christenings and all the other ceremonial markers of a life lived inside its structures. The press would report the death with the solemnity reserved for the fathers of princesses, and the obituaries would describe a man who had served his country, maintained his house, and raised a daughter who became a global icon. The obituaries would not, because obituaries rarely do, describe the custody battle, or the infant son who died at 10 hours, or the grandmother who testified against her own daughter, or the stepmother on the staircase, or the stroke-damaged years of silence, or the hospital room with nobody in it. The obituaries would describe the public John Spencer. The private one, the one this story has been telling, would remain, as always, behind the name. Charles Spencer, at 27 years old, became the ninth Earl Spencer. The transition was immediate and legally straightforward. The title passed by hereditary right, the estate passed by inheritance, And the young man who had been born to solve a dynastic problem now owned the problem entirely. He inherited Althorp, the 13,000 acres, the collections that remained after years of sales, the financial burdens that accompanied any estate of that scale, and the weight of a name that had been pressing down on Spencer men for 500 years. He inherited, in other words, everything that his father had inherited in 1975 and everything that his father had failed to transform into a household that could sustain the human beings inside it. The heir had always been the answer. Now the heir was in charge. And the question that would define his tenure, whether the next earl could do what the last one could not, had begun. Reign after 16 years as the most resented woman in the Spencer orbit was suddenly the Dowager Countess. A widow, her authority dissolved in a single afternoon, her position in the house she had managed and reshaped and defended suddenly untenable. By the accounts that emerged in subsequent years, Rain's departure from Althorp after John's death was swift and not gentle. The children who had called her acid rain, who had pushed her on staircases and excluded her from their confidences and blamed her for the deterioration of their family home, now had the power to remove her, and they did. Rain left Althorp. The house was theirs again, or rather it was Charles's, the new earl's, and through him the family's. The woman who had taken over their father's household was gone. Their father was gone. And the great house, the 500-year house, the house that had watched generation after generation of Spencers live and fail and endure inside its walls, belonged to a new generation that had no illusions about what it had cost the previous one. But the death of the patriarch did not bring the resolution that death is supposed to provide in the stories families tell themselves. It did not draw the siblings together into a shared understanding of what they had lost and what they had survived. It did not heal the wounds that John Spencer's life had inflicted, the custody battle wounds, the rain wounds, the stroke wounds, the boarding school wounds, the wounds of a childhood spent being maintained rather than held. It did not answer the questions that his death now left permanently suspended in the air above Althorp, above Park House, above the Humana Wellington Hospital, whether he had loved his children as deeply and as specifically as they needed to be loved, whether he had ever understood what his custody victory had cost them, whether the man behind the title and the house and the years of stroke-damaged silence had ever wished, in the privacy of a hospital room or a quiet afternoon in the long library at Althorp, that he could have done it all differently. Had he known in the end how alone he was? Had he felt the absence of his children in that room, or had the stroke taken even that awareness from him? Had he wanted them there? Had he tried to call? Had he, in his last hours, thought about Diana on the doorstep, or Charles in the boarding school, or Frances packing her bags, or the infant son who had lived for 10 hours and died and set everything in motion? There is no way to know. The dead keep their answers. And the living were about to discover that John Spencer's death was not the end of the family's tragedies. It was merely the end of the first act of a story that had at least one more devastating chapter to deliver. Diana's marriage would be formally separated within months. The most public unraveling of a relationship in modern British history was accelerating toward its conclusion, and Diana was about to enter the most turbulent, most visible, and most dangerous phase of her life. Without a father, without a stable home to return to, without the anchor that even a flawed parent can sometimes provide. And the woman Diana had despised most, the stepmother, the usurper, the woman she had pushed down the staircase at Althorp, was about to become, in one of this story's strangest and most human reversals, something very close to a friend. The months after John Spencer's death moved fast, because grief in this family did not arrive alone. It arrived alongside everything else that was breaking. In the same year that John died, Andrew Morton's book Diana, Her True Story, was published, a work that would, in time, be revealed as one of the most remarkable acts of a covert autobiography in modern publishing. Presented initially as based on interviews with Diana's friends, the book was later acknowledged to have been built on secret recordings Diana herself had made, answering Morton's questions on tape and passing the cassettes through an intermediary. The book laid bare what the Spencer family had spent decades concealing, and what the British establishment had no interest in acknowledging: the unhappy childhood, the mother's departure, the father's emotional absence, the lonely years at Park House and Althorp, the eating disorders, the self-harm, the misery of the royal marriage, the desperation of a woman who had entered the palace expecting to be loved and had found instead a system that valued compliance above all else. Morton's book appeared in June 1992, 3 months after John's death. The timing was coincidental, but the effect was devastating. The private Spencer history was now public property, published in paperback, serialized in the Sunday Times, discussed on every chat show and in every newspaper column in the country. The family that had always managed its reputation through silence and propriety was suddenly exposed, and the exposer was Diana herself. In December 1992, 9 months after John died in his hospital room, the formal separation of the Prince and Princess of Wales was announced by the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. The most public marriage in modern British history was over in all but legal conclusion. Diana was 31 years old, a mother of 2 sons, the most famous woman on the planet, and she was now navigating the end of her marriage without the father who might, in a different version of this story, have provided some anchor against the storm. Whether John Spencer could ever have been that anchor, given everything this story has already told you about his emotional limitations, is an open question that the family's history makes it difficult to answer with optimism. What is not open is the fact that his death removed the possibility entirely. Diana was fatherless, soon to be formally separated, living inside a palace that regarded her as a problem to be managed, and carrying the accumulated weight of a childhood that had taught her, above all, that the people who were supposed to stay would leave. It was in this context, bereaved, embattled, stripped of the structures that might have held her, that Diana did something that none of her siblings and none of the people who had watched the Spencer family's long war with Reign could have predicted. She reached out to her stepmother. The reconciliation between Diana and Reign Spencer, the woman Diana had pushed down a staircase at Althorp 3 years earlier, remains one of the most improbable reversals in the entire Spencer story. According to accounts that emerged in the years that followed, including the recollections of the journalist and royal biographer Ingrid Seward, Diana began inviting Reign to lunch at Kensington Palace. The visits were private, away from the family, away from the press, away from the siblings who had shared Diana's hatred of Reign for 2 decades. The two women met and talked. They became, in a relationship that defied every previous chapter of the Spencer saga, something close to friends. The reasons for this rapprochement are not difficult to understand once you grasp the emotional logic of Diana's life. Reign was, above all, a survivor. She had been hated by an entire family. She had been pushed, insulted, nicknamed, excluded, and ultimately expelled from the house she had lived in for 16 years. And she had endured it all with a resilience that Diana, at this point in her own life, must have recognized as something she needed. Reign had also nursed Diana's father through the worst crisis of his life. She had been at his bedside, she had fought for him, she had done, in other words, the thing that Diana most valued and that her own childhood had most lacked. She had stayed. The fact that Reign's staying had come at the cost of the children's relationship with their father was by now a complexity that Diana had learned to hold alongside the gratitude. Life had taught her that people were contradictions. Reign was a contradiction. She was the usurper and the nurse, the stepmother and the friend, the woman who had taken the house and the woman who had saved the man inside it. Diana, by her early 30s, had developed enough capacity for nuance to accept both things at once. The friendship lasted until Diana's death. That it lasted at all is remarkable. That it lasted in secret, away from the other Spencer children, is characteristic. Diana had learned from a lifetime inside dysfunctional institutions that the relationships she needed most were the ones she had to build outside the official structures. The palace could not give her what she needed. Her family could not give her what she needed. But a former stepmother, over lunch at Kensington Palace, apparently could. There is something about that detail that is worth sitting with. The woman Diana had hated most became in the end one of the few women she trusted. If you want to understand how damaged Diana was and how resilient, that friendship tells you more than any biography. Frances, meanwhile, had moved further and further from the world she had once inhabited. Her marriage to Peter Shane Kidd ended in 1990, and the years that followed were years of increasing privacy, retreat, and solitude. She settled in Scotland on the remote coastline she had chosen decades earlier when she left John and the custody battle and the whole apparatus of the Spencer world behind her. She converted to Catholicism. She devoted herself to charitable work, much of it connected to the Catholic Church. She lived quietly. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her in those years, a woman who had made peace with certain things and who had not made peace with others, and the things she had not made peace with. The loss of her children, the narrative that she was the bolter, the grandmother's betrayal, the public perception that she had abandoned her family, remained a wound that no amount of Scottish rain or Catholic devotion could fully heal. Francis and Diana's relationship in the years after John's death was complicated, as it had always been, the product of a bond that had been formed in the first 6 years of Diana's life, broken by the departure, and never fully repaired by the decades of intermittent contact that followed. They were close at times, they spoke on the telephone, they met. There were periods when it seemed as though the relationship was healing, when mother and daughter found a way to be in each other's presence without the old wound reopening. But the closeness was fragile, and it was always at risk from the differing ways they had each processed the original Spencer catastrophe. Frances had built a narrative in which she was the one who had been wronged. By John, by Ruth, by the court, by the social world that had cast her out. Diana had built a narrative in which she was the one who had been abandoned, by Francis, by John, by everyone who should have put her first and did not. These narratives were not incompatible. They could have coexisted, but they required a conversation that neither woman, shaped as they both were by the Spencer tradition of enduring rather than discussing, was fully equipped to have. The final estrangement came after Diana's loss of the HRH title in 1996, following the divorce from Prince Charles. Francis publicly expressed the view that Diana was better off without the title. A comment that was best perhaps intended as support, but that Diana experienced as a betrayal, a fresh instance of a parent failing to take her side at the moment when she most desperately needed someone to stand with her. The distance between them hardened. Mother and daughter were not reconciled at the time of Diana's death in August 1997. That fact carries a weight that no amount of contextualizing can fully absorb. Frances lost her daughter without having repaired the relationship. Diana died without having forgiven her mother for the original departure, for the years of absence, for the comment about the title, for everything that had accumulated between them since that afternoon at Park House when a 6-year-old girl stood on a doorstep and watched the drive. The story that had begun with a child waiting for a mother who promised to come back ended with the mother and daughter in different countries, holding different versions of the same wound, separated by a silence that neither of them managed to break before the chance was taken from them permanently. And then came the event that transformed the Spencer family story from a private English tragedy into a global one. But before that event, before the tunnel in Paris and the aftermath that would consume the world, there were 5 years in which Diana lived the strangest, freest, most exposed chapter of her life. After the separation in 1992 and the divorce in 1996, Diana inhabited a position for which no precedent existed. The former wife of the future king, the mother of the future king after that, stripped of her HRH title but not of her fame, expelled from the inner circle of the monarchy but not from the public's affection. She lived at Kensington Palace. She worked. She campaigned on landmines, on AIDS, on the causes that let her channel the empathy she had been practicing since childhood into something larger than personal survival. She was, in those years, both freer than she had ever been and more vulnerable than she had ever been. Free because the palace could no longer control her. Vulnerable because the palace's protection, such as it was, had been withdrawn. She was a 36-year-old woman raising 2 sons, managing a global profile, navigating a series of relationships that the press followed with predatory intensity, and doing all of it without the structural support that the institution she had married into was designed to provide. She was doing it, in other words, exactly the way she had done everything since the age of 6, since the doorstep, since the promise that was not kept, alone. On the 31st of August, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. She was 36 years old. She had been in the city with Dodi Fayed, the son of the Harrods owner Mohammed Al Fayed, And the circumstances of the crash, the speed, the pursuing photographers, the driver's condition, the conspiracy theories that would proliferate for years afterward, belong to Diana's own story and have been documented, investigated, disputed, and mourned to an extent that makes them part of the permanent record of the late 20th century. What belongs to John Spencer's story is the aftermath as it fell upon the family he had built and broken. Diana had survived her father by 5 years. In those 5 years, she had separated from the Prince of Wales, given a devastating television interview to the BBC's Panorama program, in which she spoke with extraordinary candor about her marriage, her struggles, and her sense of betrayal, finalized her divorce in 1996, and emerged into a public life that was freer and more dangerous than anything she had known before. She had become a global figure in humanitarian work. She had begun in her mid-30s to build something that looked like an independent life. And then, on a summer night in Paris, it ended. Charles Spencer, the ninth Earl, was 33 years old when his sister died. He was already carrying the weight of Althorp, the title, and the inheritance. Now he was carrying something else, the role of family spokesman, family defender, and in the most public moment of his life to that point, eulogist. On the 6th of September, 1997, at Diana's funeral in Westminster Abbey, Charles Spencer delivered an address that became one of the most memorable pieces of public oratory in modern British history. Speaking from the lectern of the same abbey where his parents had been married 43 years earlier, he addressed the congregation. The royal family sitting in the front pews, the heads of state, the celebrities, the dignitaries, and the global television audience estimated at 2.5 billion people. And he said something that the Spencer family had never, in 5 centuries of careful public behavior, said before. He challenged the institution. He challenged the monarchy. He defended his sister with a controlled fury that was unmistakably sincere. He said that Diana needed no royal title to generate her particular brand of magic. He said that the Spencer family would do their utmost to ensure that her sons William and Harry, Diana's boys, John Spencer's grandchildren, the next generation in the long Spencer chain, were not simply immersed in duty and tradition, but could sing openly from their hearts. The applause began outside the Abbey, from the crowds watching on screens in Hyde Park, and it rolled inward through the open doors until it filled the nave itself. It was unprecedented. It was, depending on one's perspective, either magnificent or inappropriate. A direct challenge to the crown, delivered inside the crown's own ceremonial space, at a moment when the nation's grief had made the monarchy vulnerable. But it was unmistakably a Spencer moment. The brother who had been born to solve a dynastic problem, the heir whose arrival was supposed to fix everything, stood up in front of the entire world and used the authority of his name to say what the palace had not said and could not say. John Spencer would never have done it. John Spencer would not have had the words his son did. The eulogy recast Charles Spencer as Diana's defender, the brother, the ally, the person who would speak for her when she could no longer speak for herself. It also placed him permanently and inescapably in the public narrative of Diana's life and death in a way that transcended his role as an earl within his estate in Northamptonshire. Charles Spencer became, from that day forward, the custodian not only of Althorp and the Spencer title, but of Diana's memory. She was buried on a private island in the ornamental lake at Althorp, the round oval as it is known, and the estate became, in addition to everything else it had been for 5 centuries, a place of public pilgrimage. Diana's grave, unreachable on its island, visible only from the shore, became a symbol that the Spencer family had not sought and could not entirely control. A famous woman, laid to rest in the grounds of her family home, belonging in death to a house that had never quite managed in life to keep her safe. The cultural machinery that surrounds any life as public as Diana's continued to reshape the Spencer narrative in the decades that followed. Morton's book, already in the public consciousness since 1992, had set the template: the unhappy childhood, the distant father, the exiled mother, the institutional cruelty of the palace. Subsequent works layered the story further. The documentary Diana, Our Mother, Her Life and Legacy, broadcast in 2017, featured Princes William and Harry alongside Earl Spencer reflecting on Diana's life with a candor that would have been unthinkable in John Spencer's generation. Princess Diana's Wicked Stepmother, also from 2017, focused specifically on the reign dynamic and the complicated affection that developed between the woman the Spencer children hated and the daughter who came to value her. The Crown, in its fourth season, released in 2020, dramatized Diana's early royal years for a global streaming audience, introducing the Spencer family dynamics to a generation that had not been alive for the original events. And Pablo Larraín's film Spencer, released in 2021 with Kristen Stewart in the title role, offered a stylized, almost hallucinatory portrait of Diana's psychological crisis during a Christmas at Sandringham. A work less interested in biographical accuracy than in capturing the feeling of being trapped inside the royal and aristocratic machinery that the Spencer name had helped to build. Each of these works told a different version of the story, none of them told the whole one. All of them used Diana as the lens through which the Spencer wounds were made visible. What none of them fully captured, because Diana's fame is so overwhelming that it eclipses everything around it, was the degree to which those wounds predated Diana entirely. They began with John. They began with the house. They began with the infant son, who died at 10 hours, and the marriage that could not survive the grief. Charles Spencer is 61 years old now. He lives at Althorp, which he has managed since his father's death in 1992. More than 3 decades of custodianship, longer than his father's own tenure. He has restored much of what reigned change, returning rooms to their earlier configurations, recovering what could be recovered of the house's pre-reign character. Althorp is maintained as both a private family home and a seasonal visitor attraction, open to the public each July and August, a period that falls, with a symmetry Charles himself has noted publicly, between Diana's birthday on the 1st of July and the anniversary of her death on the 31st of August. He is an author, a historian, a broadcaster, and a public figure in his own right, having written books on subjects ranging from the English Civil War to the family's own history to, most recently, the personal. His 2024 memoir, A Very Private School, addressed with remarkable specificity the childhood trauma he experienced at boarding school, the cruelty, the abuse, the institutional failures that he had carried silently for decades before finding, in his late 50s, the capacity to name them publicly. The memoir was not merely an act of personal excavation. It was, in the context of the Spencer story, the completion of a process that Diana had begun with Morton's book, the breaking of the family's code of silence, the refusal to endure without speaking, the insistence that what happened to the children in that family mattered and deserved to be told. Charles has been married 3 times. He has 7 children. He is, in many ways, the living repository of the Spencer story. The man who carries the title, occupies the house, tends the grounds where his sister is buried, and has spent his adult life doing what his father never could, examining, in public and without flinching, what the family cost to people inside it. Lady Sarah McCorquodale is 70 years old now. As of late 2025, she was recovering from a serious riding accident, a fall from a horse that required hospitalization and that was reported as severe. She has lived the quietest life of any Spencer sibling, maintaining her privacy with a consistency that, in a family defined by public exposure, constitutes its own kind of achievement. She married Neil McCorquodale in 1980 and has 3 children. She served for years as president of the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, managing her sister's legacy with the same steady, practical competence she has brought to everything. A woman who witnessed the whole Spencer saga from the inside, who was old enough to remember the marriage and the departure and the custody battle and the move to Althorp and the wedding and the death, and who chose almost entirely to process it in private. That choice, in a family where the private was perpetually becoming public, may have been the wisest decision any Spencer made. Lady Jane Fellows is 68. She survived the death of her husband, Robert Fellows, the former private secretary to Queen Elizabeth II, in August 2024, after decades of a marriage that had placed her at the intersection of the 2 most powerful forces in her life, the Spencer family and the Crown. Robert Fellows had been a steady, discreet, deeply institutional man who had served the Queen during some of the most turbulent years of the monarchy, including the period of Diana's public unraveling and death. Jane had occupied a position of almost unbearable complexity during those years. Diana's sister and Robert's wife, bound by loyalty to both and unable to fully satisfy either. She remains the most private of the Spencer siblings, a woman who chose the system, who served it quietly and competently, and who survived what the system demanded. Whether that constitutes a life well managed or a life constrained by the same institutional pressures that had damaged every other Spencer is a question the story leaves unanswered, because it is not the story's question to answer, it is Jane's. Frances Shand Kidd died on the 3rd of June, 2004, at the age of 68 after a long illness. She had spent her final years in Scotland on the Isle of Seal, increasingly reclusive, sustained by her Catholic faith and her charitable work and the quiet, remote life she had built in the decades since leaving Park House. She was, by the time of her death, a woman who had outlived her most famous daughter by 7 years and who had carried, for every one of those years, the knowledge that she and Diana had died unreconciled. The obituaries inevitably identified her primarily as the mother of the Princess of Wales, a final reduction of a woman who had been before all of that, a person in her own right, vivacious, intelligent, sharp, restless, a woman who had married at 18 and paid for half a century for the decision to leave a marriage that was suffocating her. She was punished by a court, by her own mother, by a social world that valued obedience above honesty, and by a public narrative that had never made room for the complexity of what she endured. She was 68 years old when she died. She had spent 50 years being defined by a departure. Ruth, Baroness Fermoy, died in 1993, 1 year after John Spencer, at the age of 85. Whether she ever regretted the courtroom testimony that had helped destroy her relationship with her daughter is a question that died with her. She is buried alongside her husband in the churchyard at Hillington, near Sandringham. In death, as in life, close to the royal estate that had been the organizing principle of her existence. Rain Spencer died in 2016 at the age of 87. She had married twice more after John's death, first Count Jean-François Pineton de Chambrun, then, briefly, returned to the social circuit with the energy that had always been her most defining characteristic. She had, in the years after Diana's death, been publicly acknowledged as someone whose relationship with Diana had been more complex and more affectionate than the acid rain mythology suggested. Her life, viewed whole, was the story of a woman who was too forceful for the family she married into and who paid for that forcefulness with decades of hostility, until, improbably and movingly, the member of that family who had hated her most became the one who understood her best. Diana rests on the island at Althorp. The grounds around the ornamental lake are open to visitors during the summer months. July and August, year after year, the public coming to pay their respects to a woman most of them never knew, but felt they understood. There is a memorial, a temple on the shore of the lake, overlooking the island, classical in design and deliberate in its positioning, where visitors can stand and look across the water at the place where the most famous woman of her generation was laid to rest by a family that had shaped her, failed her, loved her after its fashion, and lost her. The house stands behind the lake, as it has stood for more than 500 years. The honey-colored stone, the Palladian facade, the long library, the rooms that Rain redecorated and Charles restored, the corridors walked by the current Earl, who was once the baby whose birth was supposed to save the marriage and who has spent his adult life reckoning with what that marriage and that family and that house actually cost the people who lived inside it. The tourists come in summer and leave in autumn, and the house returns to what it has always been, a private place of family burden, a monument to continuity that has outlasted the capacity of the family to sustain the cost of maintaining it in human terms. The Spencer story is not a story about wealth failing to buy happiness. That formulation is too neat, too comfortable, too easily absorbed and forgotten. The Spencer story is about something more specific and more difficult to dismiss. It is about what happens when a family confuses continuity with care, when the preservation of a title, a house, a name, and a line of succession is treated as the highest good, and the emotional needs of the people inside that system are subordinated to the system's survival. The title survived, the estate survived, the line survived. What failed over and over, across 3 decades of marriages and custody battles and strokes and stepmothers and sold paintings and children sent away to schools that damaged them, was the child inside the system, the child on the doorstep waiting, the child in the boarding school enduring, the child walking up the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral toward a marriage that would break her, smiling for the cameras because that was what was expected. The child who waited always for someone to come back and sit down and stay. The house endured, the people inside it did not. And the heir who was wanted so desperately, whose birth was supposed to justify everything, spent his adulthood excavating the cost. That is not a lesson, that is just a family.